Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 96 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. For the past 6 weeks, I've been diving into the Loki show and discussing all of its details and how they relate to the comics. So I thought for variety's sake that I'd step away from comic books for at least one episode and answer a different kind of question. And I found one from faithful patron Ricky Garvin. She asked, why is it nearly impossible to make a movie based on a book that the book lovers actually like? Now, there are many movies based on books that have been both financial and critical successes over the years, including Oscar winners like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 12 Years a Slave, and The Godfather. However, while the books based on those films all sold decently well before being adapted, I would argue that none of them entered the public consciousness and became cultural touchstones the way some other books have, like, say, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, or Foundation, getting its own adaptation in just a little bit from Apple TV. And when you have legions of fans of the source material, you have an extra bar you have to reach in order to satisfy your audience. And it's that specific bar that Ricky asked about in her question to me, so that's where I'll be focusing my attention. As I discussed in episode 69, talking about movies adapted from video games, any adaptation from one medium to another is fraught with pitfalls that make it more difficult than even your average movie to succeed. Let's talk about some of those, and then I'll mention a couple that I think actually do manage to thread that needle. First, let's talk about movie length. While film runtimes have been on an increasing trend for the last 10 years or so, at least according to the research I ran across online, which I'll include a link to in the show notes, it's still fair to say that most movies run somewhere between 90 and 180 minutes, or an hour and a half to 3 hours. A standard bit of advice you'll hear for fledgling screenwriters is to assume about 1 minute of film per script page. So that gives you script lengths of 90 to 180 pages. These are all rough numbers and generalizations, but should be good enough for our purposes. Novels, on the other hand, tend to run quite a bit longer than that. In 2014, the average published book was 400 pages. In addition, a script page averages about 250 words, whereas a novel averages about 300 words per page. If you've ever seen a movie script, you'll know how spaced out the words can be compared to a standard book. So, even comparing a long movie to an average novel, the book will rack up nearly 3 times as many words as the script adapting it. Now, some of that will be taken up with character and location descriptions that take little to no space in most scripts, but even still, you're going to have to make cuts in order to fit a novel-length story into a feature-length film. And here's where you run into one of the most common complaints I hear from book fans regarding movie adaptations. They left out the best part. When cutting down and adapting the story to the big screen, the writers have to pick and choose carefully to make sure enough of the story is remaining to be understandable. In some adaptations, they fail at even that basic task. But when cutting down to the core of the plot, Character moments can sometimes be left out, and those smaller story beats are often fans' favorites, as they reveal more about the characters' personalities and motivations. Speaking of those personalities, in a book we often get a special insight to the lead character's thoughts through the point of view. Take 4 or 5 of your favorite fiction titles off the shelf and glance through them. I think you'll find that most, if not all, of them are written in one of 2 styles: first person or third person limited. In case you're unfamiliar, let's talk about those options in a little more detail. In first person, the story takes place entirely from one person's point of view. You can recognize that right away by the constant use of I and me. In this style, you're basically living inside this person's head, and you get to see and hear everything they do, almost always including their own internal thoughts. The other option I mentioned was third person limited. Third person means that all of the action and dialogue is described from the point of view of someone outside the scene. Basically a narrator who is not actually present, but is able to see and describe everything happening. Within third person, there are 2 basic subcategories: third person omniscient and third person limited. In third person omniscient, the narrator knows all, including the thoughts of anyone in the scene. Third person limited is a mix between first person and third person, as everything is described from an outside narrator's point of view, but with a focus on one particular person in the scene, including their thoughts and feelings on what is happening. Sometimes who the person being focused on will change from scene to scene, but as long as we stay in one person's head per scene, or chapter or other obvious break, then it's still third person limited. And yes, there is also second person. If you've ever read something where the action is described as being done by you as you read, that is second person. It's very rare for most novels, but is common for the Choose Your Own Adventures and similar books, where you actively make decisions for the character. So, what do these points of view have to do with movie adaptation? Well, as I mentioned, in the 2 most common styles, you get the thoughts and feelings of one of the characters, putting you inside their head and creating a very intimate relationship between yourself and that character. And while you can get a lot of people's thoughts and feelings through facial expressions, especially if you have a good actor, it's not the same as a book where you have a much more visceral connection, with the exact sensations that character experiences being conveyed to you as directly as possible. Some movies will add narration to help cover this gap, among other reasons, but depending on how and when it's used, that can actually take you out of the experience of the movie instead of helping immerse you in the film. Finally, there's the one reason that makes all adaptations basically impossible to get perfect. For most people, when they read a book, they're creating the movie version of it inside their head. Unless you have aphantasia, the inability to make mental images inside your head, when you read a good book, you're picturing how it plays out, imagining what all the characters look like, and designing the sets, lighting, and sounds yourself. After you've done that, how can any other person's vision stand up to your own? And you'll hear that when you ask someone what they thought of a movie adapting their favorite book. It wasn't what I pictured. That character didn't look how I thought they would. These are other common comments I've heard, or even made myself. For all of the reasons I've discussed, whenever the subject comes up, I will almost always recommend that people see the movie adaptation before reading the book, if that's possible. This allows you to see and enjoy the film on its own and not make comparisons. Then you can go back and read the book and discover all of the things that were cut and or the inner workings of the characters that the movie wasn't able to portray completely. I've heard some people say that if they see the movie first, it forces them to cast the characters as the actors that portrayed them when they imagine the tale they're reading. And I can understand that being an issue for some, but that doesn't bother me nearly as much as watching a movie that I've already read the book of and feeling like I've just gotten the Cliff Notes version. So I continue to go movie, then book, and recommend others do the same. So, with all of these ways that things can go wrong, are there any of them that got them right? Well, there are two that stand out to me as movies that the original fans of the book enjoyed, as well as being accessible to and popular with non-readers as well. And both of them come from the same author. In fact, both are novellas that were out of the same book. If you haven't figured it out already, I'm talking about Stand By Me and Shawshank Redemption, based on Stephen King's The Body and Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, respectively. Both were published in the book Different Seasons. Although Stephen King is best known for writing horror, neither of these stories contain any supernatural elements. If you ignore the same work adapted multiple times and just look at the different titles, Stephen King has had more of his work adapted than nearly any other author, except perhaps Shakespeare. And those run from some of the absolute best movies of all time to some of the absolute worst. But even movies based off his stories that are loved by the general public, like Kubrick's The Shining, may disappoint King's fans, because too many changes were made. King himself is known for not liking that particular adaptation. But Stand By Me, directed by Rob Reiner, and Shawshank Redemption, directed by Frank Darabont, are both well-made movies and well-made adaptations. I'm sure other people have their own titles they could point to as successful adaptations in every sense of the word, but those are the ones that came to mind for me. By the way, if you're interested in hearing reviews of specific movies and how successful they were in adapting their original source material, may I suggest Lost in Adaptation, a YouTube channel by Dominic Noble dedicated to exactly that. I have no affiliation with the show other than being a fan, but I would highly recommend watching Dominic's show as his reviews are informative and often humorous. Thank you for the question, Ricky. I hope that answer sufficed. As a reminder, this show is mostly powered by your questions, so if you have one you'd like to have answered in a future episode, or you just want to comment on the show in general, I'd be happy to hear from you. Feel free to send any and all comments and questions via email to welcometogeektown@gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them, Welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.